viewing experience that Bill Murray had in this movie, in a very succinct kind of economical way. And that's something that we really should be doing in games. In fact, as games, we do know what the players are going through. If they failed on the same miserable level 3 times in a row, why don't we just let the players skip the level? And this kind of gets back to the dramatic arc and repeat it over and over and over. I think in games this is something where we could kind of look at the players doing and not force them to experience the same frustrating things over and over. This is not really where the world works, actually, turns out. But it's what makes games really interesting. The fact that we're exploring this kind of possibility space as we play them. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about game stories and attempts at kind of bringing stories into games. And also player stories, which to me are far more interesting, really, down the road. The initial things with games were like some of the early adventure games, where it was a branching story. And you might be familiar with these old books, the Choose Your Own Adventure books, where you pick the page, look at the story, it's like everybody's seen these books. It's surprising how popular they were. But that's basically kind of what this branching model was. The very early games were basically hacking it with a branching tree. Of course, it gets very expensive as you get deeper and deeper into the story. You have to develop, a million branches. What's much more common is what I kind of call a gaming story, which you have kind of an open-ended thing. It's something like, even like Quake is almost an example of this, where you have gates within a level. You can kind of run around, do whatever you want, pick up guns, shoot whatever you like, but really you have to find the right key before you get to the next level, and it's kind of open-ended to some degree. And this has been a much more common model in games kind of over the recent history. There's kind of different topologies for the gated story. And something like the Zelda games really have a topology, something like this, where you have really some goals between the gates. And so there are room gates between the large gates, and Wind Waker is a good example of that. And there have also been hybrids between the gated and branching story. But really, all of these things are throwing data at the problem. We have to develop, a huge game world. Players will only explore a very small percentage of these trees as they play the game. And, to double the player's experience, we have to do about 4 times more work. So really, that's kind of been the downfall of these very tightly topographical branching story approaches. There's kind of more interesting approaches that are being experimented with now. Facade is kind of an experimental thing that basically takes this idea of little story fragments. This is kind of a simplification, but the idea is that you have little fragments of story that have a trigger condition and a result condition. And certain triggers can match certain results. So basically, when you grab these things, you can start putting them together like little Legos and forming a story over time. And basically, you have a pool of these things with kind of a beginning state, and you look for a matching tag. In this case, the colors are matching. And basically, you can either look at what the player's doing, or kind of randomly pull these tags out of the pool, and then they chain together, and they kind of make some causal sense. And this is something that I think is got more potential than it's currently been explored, because it's really a form of procedural storytelling at some point. It's not really clear what level we want to deconstruct the story to, though. Whether it's the boy meets girl level, or something much lower at maybe the beat level. One of my favorite short stories of all time was a story by Bruce Sterling, who I guess is talking here later today, called Mannequin Minko. And he describes this really interesting computer that people wear on their hip. And this guy's at work one day, and he's walking along, and the computer says, "Oh, if you've got a few minutes, why don't you stop and buy some milk at this convenience store?" And it's only like a minute out of his way, so he stops and buys the milk. And then as he's approaching his apartment, it says, "Oh, go 1 block over here, go to this address and deliver the milk to this lady." And he opens the door at this kind of apartment he's never been to. And there's some woman there with screaming children, and she's totally frazzled, and him bringing her milk just totally saves her day. It was a very minor effort on his part to just kind of go buy the milk and drop it off on his way home. But for her, it was a lifesaver. And it's almost like a little kind of a karma computer that keeps track of what is the easiest way to help this person's life, and who can do that at the least expense. And the more somebody actually kind of obeys this karma computer, the more it gets other people to help them. And it was a really interesting way, in my mind, of how you might take a multiplayer game and have the different players supporting the storytelling for each other. And this is something that I've heard a few people kind of talk about experimenting with, but I haven't really seen any firm results on yet. Now, the generation that we're dealing with now is kind of really used to the idea that media is a malleable thing. They make their own CDs, their own videos, they put them on YouTube, they have their own MySpace profile. To them, media is something that they kind of directly mold. Now, when I kind of grew up, my first computer, computers were really thought of more as a very, very fancy calculator, because it's number cruncher, and you do simulations and all this amazing work with it. But nowadays, it's really considered more of a communications device. If you ask the average person, what they really rely on is things like email and chat and stuff like that, and reading the news. So I think looking at technology, as player-centered rather than broadcaster-centered. In media, we kind of have this idea that we're, the media producers, and we make cool stuff like games and movies and it out to the masses. That's totally flipping around now. Now the masses are being empowered to create their own cool stuff and then share it, amongst each other. Watching players play play games, for me, is really interesting because they invariably come up with stories they use to describe what they did in the game to other players. Very rarely do I hear somebody describe the cool cutscene they saw in this game girlfriend. But all the time they're describing this really cool, weird thing that they did, unique. It's very kind of unique to them what they did in the game. And I kind of very roughly categorize these as unintentional, subversive, and expressive. The first ones are pretty simple. Unintentional stories are players come across some weird bug or some strange thing, and they make up some weird backstory for it. In The Sims, we had a lot of bugs in the very first version where some people would burst into flames spontaneously, and they said, "Oh, cool, spontaneous combustion, and it happened because of this, that, and the other." And they made this whole backstory about why the bug occurred, and then they would go post it on the internet. The expressive stories are more, subversive stories are more where players are really trying to push the boundaries of the game. They're trying to, push out the envelope in totally different directions. And they'll find cheats and weird things, and they get really excited when they find these kind of exploits that they can basically do in a game. Grand Theft Auto has all these cool exploits where you can call in a million tanks and then have them all blow up and fly into the air at once. And people would film these things. Battlefield 42, people do these amazing exploits, multiplayer, and they coordinate their activities, and then they film it and show it to the players. And it's just really fun, I think, for them to kind of play with the boundaries of the system and then kind of present the results of their experiments, really, to the players. Now, expressive stories are something more like we see in The Sims, where players, in fact, kind of have an intentional message. Grand Theft Auto, which I love, I spent the whole game just kind of developing this character, walking around, I had my kind of homeboys that I hang out with, and I found a bicycle, and it turns out you can play, do all these bike tricks on the bicycle. And I didn't really like the missions or all the shooting and all that stuff. But I basically kind of was a semi-homeless person living in this world, surviving kind of day to day. And for me, that character became very real. And I would tell my friends what happened to Mo every day. He was my guy. The Sims we saw, as we showed it to people, they started playing it, and especially when they were sitting next to each other, like might be a couple or friends or whatever, that they would be verbalizing the story as they played it. And that was really kind of their interpretation of this underlying simulation. In fact, they're simulating all these different factors, but they would reduce it to one causal linkage of, oh, she got upset because of this, and what did that, and this happened. And so even though they were dealing with a very parallel simulation, they would reduce it to a linear story. And so we put up a web page, of course, where people could put these stories up on the web, and we ended up with hundreds of thousands of stories. And for the players, it was kind of almost like performing a musical instrument. They got very good at not just playing the game, but also creating stuff in the game. And then they would want to show it off to other people.